Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all here this evening as part of the Fool's Month at Drisha. And this is the first in a new series, Technologies of Transmission, Torah and New Media, with Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. That doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly expect you to speak on a panel. It just means that you can choose to put on your camera if you wish. And when Rabbanit Wolkenfeld invites questions or comments, you can unmute and ask yourself. We just ask that when you aren't speaking, you keep yourself on mute. It minimizes the background noise so we can all hear each other. Your questions and comments are always welcome in the Zoom chat if you're in the Zoom, or in the Facebook comments if you're in our live stream, and I will be sharing a link to the source sheet in the chat. So, technologies of transmission. In an age of new media and within a culture that is constantly inventing new ways to share information, modes and media for Torah learning are being disrupted and renewed. This class will contextualize these changes with the tradition of media shifts documented in rabbinic sources and consider some of the ethical questions inherent in these technological shifts. How might we align new media with our learning goals as individuals and as a community? And what better person to teach this class? Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld is the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, an online database and interface for Jewish texts. She is passionate about expanding Jewish textual knowledge for all. Sara is a fellow at the David Hartman Center at the Hartman Institute of North America. Her previous experience includes serving as Director of Education at the Center of Jewish Life, Hillel, at Princeton University as part of the OU's Jewish Learning Initiative on campus. She studied Talmud and Jewish law at various institutions of Jewish learning in Israel and America, including Midrashat Lindenbaum, Drisha, Nishmat, and Beit Morasha, and speaks on various Jewish topics at synagogues, schools, and university communities. Sara and her family live in the I think used to live in the Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, but recently moved to
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Wolkenfeld. And with that, over to you.
Thank you. I forgot that you were going to read the whole bio. And yes, I promised to update it after. But thank you so much, Elena. And thank you to everyone for being here. It's great to see some familiar faces. And whoever's on the live stream, you're welcome to join on Zoom also. I'm hoping this will be very participatory. As you heard in my bio, I work at Sefaria, and I used to have to ask people if they knew about Sefaria. And now I usually assume that most people do know what Sefaria is, but if you don't, you can jump in and ask me. When I started to work at Sefaria, I was really excited. I felt that there was a lot of potential in using new technologies to help spread Torah. And in particular, as at the time I was a campus educator, and I saw how quickly my college students adopted new technologies, how just a little bit ahead of me they always were. And I felt immediately that it was going to be important that Torah be a part of the new technologies that they were encountering. Not everyone thought that Sefaria was a really good idea when it started. A lot of other people were really horrified. And if you are wondering to yourself, how could something like an online library of Torah texts be terrible? So you can do a little thought experiment for yourself and just think about, like in a vacuum, right? If you have no other information, if you can't see very much detail, if you can imagine somebody who's sitting on a couch reading a book. They have a book in front of them. So think about what that image conjures up for you. What do you think about that person when you imagine them sitting there, let's say for hours on end, reading a book? And then take that same picture and think about that same person is sitting on a couch and they have their phone in front of them and they're looking at their phone screen for hours. And think about what that image conjures up for you. What do you imagine about that person? Again, you have zero other information. What judgments do you make? What assumptions do you make about those two different people? So probably you do think about those things differently. And there are all sorts of cues in our society that we think differently about different ways of reading learning, transmitting information to others, we make a lot of value judgments about those things. I was reminded of this today. I was traveling most of the day, and my phone gives me alerts about my screen time. And I don't want to anthropomorphize. I don't want to say that my iPhone is judging me, but a little bit it is, right? Because books don't tell you how much book time you've spent. When I spent 45 minutes the night before reading my book, nobody said to me, "Oh my goodness, Sara, you've hit your limit of the number of minutes you can spend per day in a book." But we do have this thing called screen time, and we do make judgments around that. So we're always making ethical choices and value-based choices around the technologies that we use to take in and distribute information, but it's often just a knee-jerk kind of thing. We don't always think through those choices that we're making. And so in this series of classes that we're going to have together, I want to think about what we might learn when we encounter Torah through new media, how our tradition has weathered past media shifts, and what we might have learned in sort of making these judgments about other people, about ourselves, about technologies that we've encountered, what we've learned that we might want to apply to the digital revolution and to the changes that are happening right now. So I want to first define my terms a little bit, and then I'll ask at least those of you who are in the Zoom room, I'll ask you some questions to kind of get a baseline for how we're feeling about technology here tonight. So first of all, I want to say that technology, as I speak about it, is not specific to modern innovations. So I would never use technology as being synonymous with a computer, for example. When I talk about technology, I don't mean Zoom. I mean technology in its broadest sense. It's the application of science, engineering, and industrial organization to create a human-built world. There are other similar definitions. That's the one I like to work with. Anything that humans build to fulfill a human purpose is technology. And that means that in my work with educators, when I go into a classroom, technology is the computer, and it's the smart board, and it's the Chromebooks that the kids have, if they have them, but it's also the whiteboard and the markers and the notebooks or the binders. Those are all technologies also. And so when I ask us to think about technologies over the course of these 3 classes that we're going to have together, I want us to think really broadly about the tools that we use in order to fulfill a human purpose, in order to mediate our world, and how those are, or how and when those are good tools. And so the other terminology that I want to introduce that's going to be important for us is what's called a use case, which is kind of, for me, it was kind of engineering speak. I didn't know that particular term until I started working at Sefaria. So maybe you've heard it, maybe not. A use case just means that different technologies are good for different things. So the easiest to understand example, I think, is that forks and spoons are both great technologies. Hopefully you agree with me, both a fork and a spoon, highly important technologies. However, soup is a bad use case for a spoon, for a fork, sorry, or said a different way, right? A fork is not optimized for the use case of soup. Spoons are optimized for the use case of soup. And sometimes when you try to use something, it really is a bad technology. I'm sure we've all had those experiences. And other times you're just trying to use it for something that it's not really for. And that's really important because most of the time, I'd say much of the time, when we say that X is bad, or it's a bad technology, it's like the question is like, what is it bad for? Is it bad for everyone at all times? Maybe. We could have conversations about that. We could think that maybe, I don't know, social media, right? Like even if it has positive use cases, it's just generally bad, or the bad outweighs the good. But usually what we're going to talk about is, it's good for optimizing for X and it's bad for optimizing for Y. And we might then decide we don't want to use this technology at all because the bad outweighs the good, but technologies are generally built for a specific purpose. And so the question is like, what's the use case? What use case is it good for? And what use case is it not good for? So those are the kinds of questions that we'll be exploring as we look at the text together. And I think it's not surprising in some ways that Judaism has so many texts that are reflective about technology, because Judaism is quite reflective about learning. And I mean, if I asked you to just, off the top of your head, name some texts from from the Bible, from Chazal, that speak to the power of learning Torah, the importance of learning Torah, the centrality of learning Torah. I'm guessing you could come up with at least one or two without thinking too hard about it. Any culture, any religion that spends that much time thinking about Judaism, right? Thinking about the process of learning, it makes sense that they're also going to be reflective about what that looks like, what it looks like to learn, what it looks like to teach, and what technologies are going to be implicated in that. And like us, I'll say broadly speaking, like most of us, like human society throughout the ages, Chazal are often quite skeptical of new technologies and also quite excited about new technologies. And I would say like those are the two extremes that you get when you come up against new technologies. So I put the title of this first class, I wrote early adopters and early resistors, because anytime you have early adopters, right, people who rush to use a new technology, you also have early resistors, the people who right away say, this is a terrible thing. So I don't know how old everyone in this space is. I will date myself and say, I can definitely remember a time when TVs were the worst possible technology. Televisions were like the evil technology because smartphones had not been invented when I was growing up. And I grew up in a time that was already after the time when books were the worst possible technology. But there was a time in human history when books were considered to be a pretty harmful technology. I'm talking about printed books that you could, buy and put on the shelf. And even a little bit, I know that when I was a little girl, I remember my grandmother sometimes telling my mother that I spent too much time. Why doesn't she go outside? Like, why is she always inside of the book? So it wasn't never judged negatively, but I would say that for most people today, the idea of a book as a dangerous piece of technology, as something that's corrupting, as something that is like takes over your mind in negative ways, that's not mostly how we see books written about and spoken about and thought about. Again, because go back to that thought experiment about the person who's sitting on the couch with a book versus the person who's sitting on the couch with a phone. And we won't even talk about the person who's sitting on the couch in front of the TV, which is a whole other story. So we're always making these judgments. There are adopters, there are resistors, and there are the rest of us who are kind of in between. And so we're going to look at some of the texts that, again, I think quite authentically to the Jewish tradition, explore this tension over trying out new technologies. The new technology in this case, spoiler alert, will not be digital Torah, but it will be something that was new for Chazal. So just to orient us a little bit more into this space, I guess at least for those of you who are on the Zoom, does anyone have a favorite technology for learning Torah, for taking in new Torah information? You can unmute and say it, or you can put it into the chat.
I love Safaria.
Safaria, great. I like it too. What do you like about it?
I think that I got to be honest, the translations aren't always the best, but just the ease with which I can kind of jump around and find things. I like that I can bookmark and find things back again. I can annotate. It's very easy to collect source sheets. As you say, the use, I'm blanking on your word already, but it's, say it again, I'm sorry?
The use case.
Use case, thank you. So somebody really thought it through very clearly. The use case is a perfect match for what I use it for.
Amazing. So Safaria, and Lily Naz also said Safaria. And you mentioned, Miriam, being able to bookmark sources, being able to move quickly from source to source, kind of finding what you're looking for, and then also gathering those sources and making source sheets. So exactly as you said, those are all different use cases. And some technologies are better or worse for that, right? Like, so I'll tell you one technology that's really, really bad if you want to move quickly between sources is, any takers? Yeah, go ahead. You guys can unmute yourselves. Books are pretty bad, but there's one even worse if you want to move quickly between sources. Yeah, go ahead, Emily. I can't hear you because you're muted.
Scrolls.
Scrolls are the worst possible technology for moving between sources. And I think that's really important because broadly speaking, we, meaning most Jews in the modern world today, use scrolls on a very regular basis. I don't know if you've noticed, we're kind of the only ones, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Scrolls are not a technology that are optimized for most of the use cases we care about today. So later on, we can talk about why scrolls get used. Right. Any other favorite technologies for learning or transmitting information? Yeah, go ahead.
I still love books. My
Great.
technology is, paper still. I mean, my favorite.
And what do you love about books?
I can write in them easily. I can, they're tactile. And also they're organized. In other words, and I mean, obviously part of this is me, my just facility with it because of, my age, because of how I use technology, but they're organized in ways that are good for me.
Yeah. Books kind of stay where you put them, right? Like you can't change the order of book pages. I mean, you can, but it's like really hard work, right? Like basically the first page of the book is going to stay the first page of the book, which is not going to be true in a digital space necessarily. And it's tactile. So it's something you can hold on to, which is something that we're going to keep coming back to. P.S. That might be a very good thing about scrolls, right? That might be something that scrolls really have going for them that other technologies don't. And I think also familiarity is a really, you sort of said it like in a self-deprecating way, but I think that is like not to be ignored in terms of thinking about technologies. It's not, I don't necessarily think that that is a not important reason, right? Like it might not mean that you should always hold on to an old technology, but it is really important, especially our focus is about learning and teaching Torah. So especially if you're learning or teaching Torah, it's really important to feel comfortable. And if you're already in a sort of out of your comfort zone in terms of the learning you're doing, right? Because you're challenging yourself, you're trying something new, to also be out of your comfort zone in terms of the technology that you're using may not be a great idea. And that's definitely something that we have to take into account when making these choices also. Amazing. I will say that a technology that I have experimented with in the last few years is podcasts, which I think has some pros in terms of being a good technology for me, namely that it leaves my hands free to do other things. But it's not, I'd say for me, it's not a perfect technology because if I really want to remember something, I have to write it down. And then I have to pause the podcast and write it down. And so, but it's still, I think, like in the better than nothing category. But, I think
but that
I have enjoyed that. Yeah.
But it's not just an inconvenience that you have to stop it and write it down. It's a different kind of attentiveness that we employ, a different kind of focus when we're listening to something almost as background music.
Yeah.
No, but depending on the context, obviously, as
right.
opposed
to
what
you're doing, what you're listening to. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And yet I do think that there is a way in which it has the potential to be very powerful technology for spreading information, and like has proven itself to be. So I think it's worth taking seriously, even though like I agree with you, right, that there is a way in which it can be just like sort of background music. Okay, so with all of that in mind, right, thinking about where your comfort zone is in terms of technology, let's jump into this story in the Gemara. My preference is usually not to share my screen because I like to see people and I like people to see each other. So for now, I'm not, but if that becomes an issue for anyone, let me know and I'll share it. I'm starting at the first source that's on the source sheets. This is the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Samech. And like I usually like to give people context, I will say there's not a lot of context here that is important for understanding this story. Somehow the Gemara gets into a conversation about Torah reading and who reads Torah first, or who gets called to the Torah first in any given aliyah set. And from there, they seem to go into other questions surrounding Torah reading. So here's the problem that the Gemara wants to address. Shalchu lebnei Galil leRabbi Chelbo. A question gets sent to Rabbi Chelbo from the people of the Galil. Mahu likrot b'chumashim bebeit hakneset b'tzibur. What is the halacha? What would it look like to read from a chumash? I'm going to leave that word untranslated for a second, but you have English there, so you're not lost. What would it look like to read from a chumash in shul, in public, in the community? So using a chumash, what is a chumash? Well, for us, it's like a printed volume of the Torah. But obviously, that's not what it is for them because they don't have a printing press, they don't have books. For them, it's chumash in the sense of 1/5. So it is 1/5 of a 5-volume set. It's a scroll, still a scroll, but it has either Breshit or Shmot or Vayikra. You get the idea. So can you use a single scroll instead of a full Torah scroll to read Torah in the communal reading, let's say, on Shabbat? Thumbs up, thumbs down. What do we think the answer should be? Lily Nas thinks yes, that you can. Can think about it for a second. Disappointing, maybe. The immediate response in the Gemara is lo hava biyade. Rabbi Chelbo didn't know the English here as an answer was not readily available to him. I actually think, and I haven't proven this yet, I plan to, but I think that the language of lo hava biyade is actually significant here, that there's more than one way in the Gemara to say that a rabbi didn't have an answer. Lo hava biyade, to your point earlier, Emily, is the most tactile way that you could express that. Lo hava biyade to me suggests he didn't have an answer because he maybe also didn't have that physical technology available to him. Like it just wasn't an object that he possessed. It wasn't something that they did, and he didn't know the answer. Now, why would you want to read from one volume of a 5-volume set in shul? Why would you want to read from like if the Torah is like this, so you're reading from this. Why might you want to do that? Anyone want to say? Yeah, go ahead.
I think because reading from 1/5 of it, or better the other way, when you read from the whole thing, you're asserting that it's a unit, that the 5 books together are a unit, that they're a canon, they have an established status together.
Okay, so that's why you'd want the full Torah scroll, right? You would want the full Torah scroll because it's a full canon together. I think that's very plausible. Why would you go the other way? Yeah, Lily Nas.
Like maybe it's smaller and more manageable. I know a lot of old like Torah scrolls are like huge and really heavy. Maybe if you don't have lots of strong people around, it's also, I think, probably cheaper. Like,
yeah,
say you're like a new community, you have to pay a scribe and buy all the like animal skin, and maybe you're just gonna buy one book at a time over the year because you're collecting funds.
So I think like a very real answer is economics. Exactly as you said, right? Maybe you start your shul, you kick off on Simchat Torah, so you buy Sefer Breshit, and you assume your shul is going to be so successful that over the course of the next number of weeks, you're going to raise enough money to buy Shmot. I think that's a real answer. I think a more fun answer is the one-word answer, right? Why would you use just a single scroll? One word, friends, Hagba, right? It's much lighter. It's much easier. But I think the economic answer is probably real. I also think that there are, if you've ever been the person who had to roll the Torah to the appropriate place, you can think about how much easier it would be to do that if you had just a single chumash. But to Emily's point, I also think there is something about the canonicity of having the full Torah scroll. And for the record, just so we're keeping track, has anyone ever been in a shul where they read from a single Torah scroll? No, it's lo hava biyade, and I would say the same thing today, right? Like it's not a thing that really happened. So he didn't have an answer. So what are they going to do? They don't have an answer. Next stage, Ata Shaila Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. So Rabbi Chelbo goes and asks a different rabbi. He asks Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, lo hava biyade. Same thing. He didn't know the answer either. So now you have the sense that this is really a conundrum. This is a new technology. And by the way, this happens all the time. I I myself am a Rabbanit. I'm married to a pulpit rabbi. I cannot tell you how, maybe not, it's not a daily occurrence, it's not a weekly occurrence, it's at least a monthly occurrence that I get asked a question about a technology that I have not encountered. How do you kosher this new kind of stovetop? What about, this new kind of cooking gadget that I have literally never seen or heard of before, and I'm Googling, and, all of a sudden social media is giving me ads for like renovate your kitchen, and I'm just trying to figure out, how to kosher this new kind of pot that I've never heard of before. So this happens a lot, actually. And I don't know that this was a new technology, but it was a new use case at least. And they're trying to figure out, can it be used in this way? So here's the next stage. Atashal Beit Midrasha. Yitzchak Nafla comes and asks this question in the Beit Midrash to the whole study hall. They try to solve this difficulty by applying a statement that they already have in hand, as it were, right? Something that they already know as established fact. Sefer Torah shechaser yiriyah achat ein korin bo. If you have a Torah scroll that's missing one yiriyah, one like panel of parchment, you can't read from that Torah scroll in a public Torah reading, right? That is not kosher for performing the communal reading. And the implication seems to be, well, if you can't use that, then you for sure can't use a single chumash. Good analogy, bad analogy. Spoiler alert, the Gemara does not think that's a good analogy. And it's really indicative of how they're thinking about this technology. The Gemara says, Velohi, it's not the same thing. Hatam mechaser b'milta. In that case where it's missing a panel, it's actually missing something. It's analogous to, I actually don't have a 5-volume Torah on my shelves here to point to, but if you had, right, if you had that 5-volume, imagine the 5-volume like Torah Chaim or Mikro Gedolot set, and you have all 5 volumes, and one of the volumes is missing a page. That's really like a problem. That is an incomplete book. And that, the Gemara says, is what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about when he says that the Torah scroll is missing a sheet of parchment. It's just like really not complete. But in this case, it's not missing anything. Right? What are you buying? You're buying the 1 volume. You're paying for Sefer Breshit, right? To Lily Naz's point, it's going to cost less than the 5-volume work, but you're not going to go back to the bookseller or to the sofer and say, hey, there's something wrong with this book. There's something wrong with it. It was meant to be Sefer Breshit, and it is Sefer Breshit. It's not a book that is in and of itself lacking. And so the Gemara rejects that comparison, and the Gemara tries again. Rabbi and Rav Yosef, Amri Travaihu. Rabbi and Rav Yosef both say, Ein korin b'chumashin b'beit hakneset mishum kavod tzibor. You can't read from a chumash, from a single volume of a 5-volume set in services, right, as part of the communal Torah reading, because of kavod tzibor, because of the honor of the congregation. Why is it beneath the honor of the congregation to read from 1 volume of a 5-volume set? The Gemara doesn't tell us. Kvod Tzibor has actually become quite a loaded term in terms of people thinking about some of the other places that it's used in the Gemara. But I would just say, for our purposes here, it's somehow beneath the dignity of the congregation. And that means that it might be fine as a book, but it's not the right technology for this use case. Maybe because, as Lilina said, it's cheaper. And so maybe it's like an indication of like, hey, this congregation couldn't actually afford a full Torah. Or maybe it's because somehow we have the idea that the mitzvah is best done with a full Torah scroll. And to do it in this other way is somehow lesser, even if it would make shul membership dues lower, even if it would make Hagbah easier, it's somehow a lesser form of performing the mitzvah. Can you have a 5-volume set of scrolls in your shul? Sure, you could have a 5-volume set of scrolls in your shul. You just can't use it for the communal Torah reading, according to this view. That seems to resolve that particular question. And the Gemara is going to then sort of move us along to a different case. For Rabba Rav Yosef to Amri Travahu, Hai Sefer Aftarata, Asur Lemikre Be B'Shabbat. Rabba and Rav Yosef say, they both say, that you are not allowed to read the Haftarah. Again, we're talking about the public reading. In Shul, on Shabbat, you've just finished Torah reading, now it's time to read the Haftarah. You're not allowed to read the Haftarah from a book of Haftarot. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. Just to, sort of take everyone's temperature, have you ever been in a place where Haftarah is read from a book of Haftarot? Yes. Has anyone been in a place where they read the Haftarah from something other than a book of Haftarot? Yes. Okay, you both have. Yeah, tell me.
I once was somewhere where they had a scroll of Haftarah, which was really cool.
It is really cool. Some places do have scrolls. Emily, you're muted.
In my shul, it's every week.
In a scroll.
Yeah.
That's really nice.
A special scroll. And it looks like a Sefer Torah, except smaller. And it's, in fact, when they take the Torah out and they bring it around shul, they follow with the Sefer Haftarot.
And what's in the scroll?
Just the Haftarot.
All the Haftarot. Right. That is what they're talking about. Right. When they say Sefer Haftarot, that is literally what they're talking about. Again, they don't have books. So right. your case, right, is the same as my case. Meaning in my shul, they read from like a book of Haftarot, like it looks like, a book. And in your case, they read from a scroll. But the thing that Rabbi and Rav are saying is forbidden is that, right? It's essentially the same object. Because when they say Sefer, they mean a scroll. So a scroll that contains Haftarot, right? So it's exactly I'd say experientially for us, this is the opposite of the last case, right? None of us have ever been in a shul where they read the Torah reading from just the single book of the Torah, whether in scroll form or in book form. But it seems like all of us have been in places where the Haftarah is read from a book or scroll that is composed of multiple Haftarot, as opposed to just, let's say that the Haftarah is from Sefer Zechariah. The alternative would be you open up a scroll that contains all of Sefer Zechariah. Not a lot of places do that. I don't think it's like never done, but not a lot of places do that. And that's essentially what's being argued here, is that when you read the Haftarah, you should open a scroll that has that whole book. And that's how you should read. And a Sefer Haftarata, right, a book that has multiple Haftarahs one after another, that would be prohibited. Again, begging the question, why? Well, this time the Gemara is actually going to ask that question. My taima, what's the reason? Delo nitan likatev, because you're not allowed to write that kind of scroll. Now, of course, you're going to ask me why. We can talk about that in a second. But I just want you to recognize that this is a major shift in the Gemara. This shift is essentially the question that's being adjudicated. When Israel's not on the front page of all the newspapers, this is the question that's on the front page of the newspapers right now. When do we say about a technology that it should not exist versus it shouldn't be used for a particular purpose? So up until now, we've been talking about, can you use this single volume set, right? Can you use that for this particular case of reading Torah publicly? But we never said you can't write those books. We never said you can't own those books. We just said can't use it for public Torah reading. I'm sure there's still lots of great use cases for a 5-volume set of the Chumash. But what just happened, right, what the Gemara just said, is that the reason you can't use this book of Haftarot to read from is because you're not even allowed to write it. This is a complete ban on this technology, which is, again, akin to saying we need to stop developing AI because it's just bad, right? Not you can only use it for this, you can't use it for that, just stop developing it. That's essentially what the Gemara is advocating, at least for a second there. And then the Gemara goes on to say, I'm not going to get as deeply into this, well, if if it can't even exist, maybe you can't carry it on Shabbat either. So getting into muktzah issues, maybe you can't even move it around on Shabbat if it's that forbidden. But then the Gemara says velohi. It's not true. Shari l'taltule ushari l'mikrebe. You're actually allowed to carry this Sefer Haftarah. You can hold this book of multiple Haftarahs. Ushari l'mikrebe, and you can even read from it, which I guess means also, right, you were allowed to produce this kind of technology. And how do we know this is true? Here's the proof text, or the case that proves it. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish ma'ayne b'sifrei de'agadah b'shabta. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, a famous first generation Amoraic pair. They show up a lot in the Gemara. They learned together. They were chavrutzas. They used to read from or look at a book of Agadah on Shabbat. Agadah are rabbinic stories, right? It's sort of like the part of the Talmud that's like story-based and not so strictly halachic and legal. So they would look at this book on Shabbat, which is really interesting. Where they get this book from, right? Who was producing this black market technology for them, where they get it, why they do it. We don't have a lot of details. But the Gemara is really upset about that story because here you have two fine, upstanding rabbis who are doing something that seems to be problematic. Why is it problematic? We'll find out more in a minute. But you're not even allowed to write that kind of book. You shouldn't even be writing this down to begin with. Ella kevan zelo efshar. Rather, it's because it's impossible. The English here adds in that it's not possible to remember the oral law without writing it down. And that the only way you can remember Torah Shebaal Peh, maybe the only way you can remember anything, is by writing it down. And so it was impossible it would have been impossible to preserve it otherwise. Now, you can file away that really interesting question of whether actually the best way to remember something is to write it down or to memorize it. I think your answer to that will depend a lot on all sorts of things, like who you are and how you were raised and what kind of education you had. But I will just say for me, it's not a slam dunk that that's always 100% incontrovertibly true. But maybe that's what the Gemara is arguing. The reason that the English Steinsaltz inserts those words there is probably because of a parallel sugya in the Gemara in Smura, which I also put as the next source on your sheet. We won't read it together, but in that source, it's explicit that what they were afraid of was forgetting. So there was no other way to preserve Torah other than by writing it down. And the Gemara's biblical proof text for this, or like their excuse, maybe this is a phrase you've heard before. It is a phrase from Tehillim that actually means it's a time to act for God because people have nullified your Torah. And the way the Midrash reads it, the way the Gemara reads it midrashically, is it's time to act for God even by nullifying Torah, meaning you can break rules if it's going to ultimately preserve Torah better. So that was the justification for Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan having this forbidden technology of a written book of rabbinic words. And the Gemara says, Hachanami kevan zelo efshar et lasot l'Hashem hefer Tortecha. And so too in this case, back to our original case, right, the one that we're actually trying to adjudicate about a scroll of Haftarahs, so too it's impossible. It's impossible not to use this kind of book. Why? Presumably not because of forgetting, but maybe because of, as the English translation here suggests, maybe expense. So if your shul, like Emily, I'm especially picturing the case that you gave of like they take out the Haftarah scroll with the Torah. So you could imagine in Rabbah and Rav Yosef's ideal world, instead of having one Torah scroll and one Haftarah scroll, there's probably more than one Torah scroll, but instead of taking out that one Torah scroll and one Haftarah scroll, you'd have a full set, right? So you'd have all of Nach as single volumes, and you'd have to pick out the one for that week. But having all those different books. Okay, you probably don't read Haftarah from every single book of Nach. Someone out there knows the spread of books, but it's a lot more volumes you have to own, right? Rather than just that one single scroll that has all the Haftarahs conveniently located within it. That would be a much bigger expense for the congregation. And so it's okay. It would be impossible otherwise, is what the Gemara says. And so we get to kind of cheat a little bit and have that kind of book, which is to say that the Gemara recognizes that sometimes there are needs that might push you to adopt a new technology, even when you previously had thought that that was not a good technology. Now, I think that there's a lot of questions that this raises, like, how do you know that you're at that point? Right? How did the Gemara really know that, like, this was Eit La'aseh Hashem? It's the moment to act for God. Great. How are we all going to agree that this is the moment instead of like in 5 years or in 10 years? I don't think that the Gemara fully resolves that question, nor is it meant to, right? It's clearly retrospective. By the time this Gemara is being pulled together, this has already happened. This is a done deal. There are certainly written texts, and scholars have written a lot about the idea of oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh, oral law, as a kind of construct of the Gemara rather than something that actually fully existed, meaning nobody was memorizing everything. There were probably bits of written text, but still they had this idea of full books not being written down and of books appearing, again, books in this case are scrolls. They appeared only in certain ways, and it was like, Ad Khan, you're allowed to do this and no more. And at some point, it was like, no, we are going to do a little bit more. We are going to go further. Again, bringing us back to this idea about memorization versus things that are written down. I think it's worth pausing. I'm not going to ask you for your answers because I want to see the end of this Gemara together. But at least take a moment to think about where would you locate oral Torah in your life, and where would you locate written Torah? Meaning, what's the important oral Torah that you've gotten in your life? What have you learned from talking to other people or heard transmitted from person to person? And what have you really learned through reading, looking at written text, etc.? And how do those two things have different impact on you? And then kind of coming back to the question I sort of teased earlier, when you think about how you want to preserve and transmit information, when do you reach for an oral Torah mode, right? When you want to tell people or memorize it for yourself, and when do you want to write it down? I think that the preservationist urge, both for ourselves and for other people, is very, very strong. I think of it as being particularly for Jews around Jewish texts, and it's kind of a sad conversation that I often wind up having. If you have Torah that is transmitted from person to person, is it easier to lose or harder to lose than something that's written? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's definitely harder to lose.
Harder to lose because it's like, yeah, because it's being transmitted from one person to another, multiple people know it.
Yeah, and also I think there's sometimes like a value that people place on it. Like if I think about, all the books that all the rabbis have written and how few of them we actually have today. But then I guess how many of their like oral texts do we have today? I think I just found a hole in my own argument.
This is why it winds up always being somehow a sad conversation, right? Because whenever, just again, I've talked to a lot of people about this, inevitably, when I talk about transmitting, whichever one I start with, like the conversation goes in a particular direction. So if you start from, as you did, right? No, it's better when things are transmitted orally, because then you can sort of keep passing it down. But then what can happen? Sometimes those don't get remembered. Right? Sometimes those people don't survive. Yeah. And that's like one side of the really sad coin. Then when I have the conversation in the other direction, with the people who advocate that it's better to write text down, well, written text can be preserved. And what else can happen to written texts?
They can also be lost.
They can also be lost. We have a lot of book burnings in our history, friends. I was in Italy a month ago. I'm here to tell you, we have a lot of book burnings in our history. And so it's neither of these really is like, a slam dunk. And if you want to like put it in really mundane terms and make it sort of kind of lighter, right? Think about how many times I won't put this on anyone else. I will think about how many times I have decided I need to remember something, written it down, and then I have gone on to lose the piece of paper on which I wrote the thing down. Right? That's just a thing that can happen. So it's hard to say which is the greater kind of preservationist urge, or which satisfies that urge more so than the other. They're both ways of preserving information. And that's why I think it's helpful to think of this in terms of use case, right? When is oral Torah really what's needed? When is written Torah really what's needed? Ariel asked a question in the chat about what Chazal's do writes a basis to not write down Torah and only transmitting Torah orally is. We're going to look at it in a second, though I will say that I'm not sure that the category of D'Oraita and D'Rabbanan is really a relevant category here. They're not really claiming that, nor is it clear that that's like a lens that's sort of brought, universally. But it is a good question. And I think that, it's also a strange feature of this text that all of a sudden the Gemara jumps into assuming, oh, well, you can't write down, rabbinic stories. Like, wait, why not? You didn't tell us that part yet. And it's almost, I think, like kind of transparent about itself. Like the Gemara itself is oral Torah in some ways. You wouldn't, to your point, Emily, earlier about how books are like well structured. If I were writing a book about this, I would have to tell you first that there is this prohibition against writing things down. Otherwise, my reader would just be confused, which is actually what's happening right here, right now. So let's look a little bit at the end of this Gemara. I'm skipping over the Gemara in Smura, which, as I mentioned, I just put there as a point of comparison. You're welcome to read it afterwards. The next source that I have is a verse in Sefer Shemot, in Exodus, that the Gemara is going to refer to. So I just wanted you to have it in front of you. It's pretty, on its own, I think it's a pretty not so dramatic verse. God says to Moshe, write down these words, or write down these commandments, because in accordance with these commandments, I'm going to make a covenant with you and with Israel. But the Gemara is going to play with these words a little bit. So this is, where'd it go? Did I lose the Gemara on here? Oh no, it's just a little bit further up here. Nope. Okay, I'm going to pull it up and share my screen. So the end of the Gemara goes on to sort of talk more about, what are some different use cases? When might it be possible, right? Going back to this idea of writing just like a partial text, when might it be possible to do that, to write a partial text? And explores different cases where it might or might not be possible. We'll put it that way. But then the Gemara returns to this question, basically your question, Ariel, about what is even going on with this this discomfort around writing down certain kinds of Torah. And again, it doesn't make any sense if you don't already know, which the Gemara kind of assumes that you already do know, that there is something called Torah shebichtav, and there is something called Torah sheba'al peh. So Torah shebichtav, written Torah, Torah sheba'al peh, oral Torah. What's the major problem with dividing Torah into those two categories? Actually, there's a lot of problems. But one problem is that for us, all of these things are books on a shelf. We don't actually have that distinction, really. That's one major problem. And then again, the other major problem is that the Gemara never really kind of drills down on these definitions. Also, it's clear in Tanaitic literature that there are multiple ways of dividing Torah. This is only one of them, right? The oral versus written. And so it's kind of interesting that the Gemara, kind of like fixates on this one, right? You didn't have to choose this one necessarily. Anyway, the Gemara decides to interrogate these two different kinds of Torah. I'm going to share my screen so I can show this to you, because I think it didn't make it onto the source sheet. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Torah rov bichtav umiyut al peh. Rabbi Elazar says most Torah was given in writing, and a minority was given orally. Shne'emar, as it says in a pasuk in Hosea, Echtov lo rubei torati kmo zar nechshavu. I will write the majority of my Torah for him or for them, and they'll be considered, and the English here is they were reckoned a strange thing, or they're considered a stranger. We'll leave the proof text for a second, but the important part there is rubei torati, right? I wrote most of the Torah. Rabbi Yochanan amar rov al peh umiyut bichtav, shne'emar ki al pi hadvarim hayel. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you've got it all wrong. Most of the Torah was given orally, and only a minority was given in writing. And we know this because that pasuk in Exodus, in Shemot, says, ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela. Right? In accordance with these things, or on the basis of these things, al pi sounds a lot, if you kind of squint, like al peh. And so the idea is these matters, right? These words, these commandments are al peh. They're oral. And that's the proof text for saying that most of the Torah was given orally. Now, I'm going to guess, and you would probably guess also, that we're not actually having a quantitative argument. I don't know, like, who would win in that case, and why would these psukim be relevant? What we're really saying is, what's the essence of Torah? Is the essence of Torah oral, or is the essence of Torah written? Again, I think your instinctive answer to that, I don't know if there's like an absolute truth out there, but your instinctive answer to that is going to depend a lot on how you think about oral Torah and how you think about written Torah, meaning how you think about orality and how you think about writing. And the two sides of the argument debate this back and forth a little bit. I'm going to skip over that. But they kind of play with each other's proof texts. And then you have the big reveal that Ariel was asking about. Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, Miturgamani de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Reish Lakish's Miturgaman, his translator, his disseminator of information, said, the pasuk says, Tov lecha et hadvarim ha'ela, write down these things. And it also says, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela. Again, on the basis of these matters, but it's a play on words to mean orally. HaKetzad, how do you have both of these things in one verse? Dvarim shebichtav iyata rashai le'omran al peh, dvarim sheba'al peh iyata rashai le'omran bichtav. Anything that was given in writing, you can't make oral, and anything that is given orally, you can't put in writing, which, by the way, we'll talk about next time, is interesting that usually you only hear about one side of this statement. When the Gemara mostly talks about this, when people sort of repeat it, it's all about writing down oral Torah. What would it look like to take written Torah and make it oral? We'll talk about it. But that seems to be the operational principle here. So that's their proof text, right? That's how they quote unquote know that you can't play with media, that things that are meant to be oral stay oral, things that are meant to be written stay written. And the only things you're allowed to write, Ela atakotev. These are the things you can write. Via takotev halacha. You can't write down halacha. You can't write down oral law. Some things can be written. Some things cannot be written. The things that were given orally cannot be written down. And this is an idea that really gets built out, not just here in the Gemara, but also in other midrashic sources. So just to pro-con for a single moment, before we look at the midrash and wrap up for the night, what's great about oral Torah? We talked a little bit about some of the dangers. What's great about oral Torah? You can just unmute and call out, or you can put in the chat. What's great about oral transmission?
You don't just have a connection to the content of the text, you have a connection to a person.
Great. Social relationships, teacher-student relationships, it really brings you closer to a person. Anything else that's great about oral Torah?
Sometimes Torah doesn't make sense without it.
Yeah, because words are just words on a page, something like that.
Well, I mean, I guess you could also say sometimes Judaism doesn't make sense without it, because why does a chicken and cheese not go together? You know what I mean? So like
So
And there's
oral
also-
Torah kind of
yeah.
fills in gaps, right? Is that what you're saying?
I guess.
Okay. Anything else that's great about oral Torah?
You can say something and you're not as like committed to it as if you were writing it in stone and writing a formal opinion. And there's a flexibility when you're talking that I think gives more freedom.
Much less fixed, much more adjustable, and inflected, I'm going to say is the word, right? Like I can say, and this is, by the way, like I think a major generational divide in terms of texting. I put in punctuation when I text. My kids are like, oh my God, Ima, never text me with a period, right? It's so scary when you do that, right? Because I'm trying to put in that meaning, but they're resisting it. And spoken words are inflected in a way that written text is not. And that flip side of permanence, I also love that you brought that up. Everyone's like, oh, well, writing is so much more permanent. Yeah. And like, there's a reason that we have the words like the phrase carved in stone, right? It's not always a good thing. And then you have the flip side with written text, right? It's more fixed. It's maybe feels more permanent. It isn't necessarily always, but you do have to put more thought into it. It is uninflected. It is a really different way of learning things. And then there's really the relationship piece. And where this Gemara, and we'll look at the very ends of it next time, but where this Gemara ultimately winds up, where this, I'd say, midrashic tradition ultimately winds up, is, and I put the midrash from Shemot Rabbah on as the last source on your pages here, and I'm just going to sort of tell part of it over to you. The midrash says that after God gave the Torah to Moshe, God said to Moshe, okay, now go teach it to everybody else. And Moshe said, wouldn't it be a great idea if I like wrote it down? Like I have this great idea for like the technology of sort of widespread pedagogy. I will write down these books and everyone can go read these books and that would be awesome. Actually, that's interesting, Miriam. I don't actually think that that's part of Rabbi Elazar's arguments in this case. I think it's actually the opposite. Because if you look at the continuation of this midrash, God says to Moshe, I don't want you to write it down. And that's sort of surprising. So God says, yeah, like if you have written texts, they can be passed around really broadly. And eventually, and again, there's a few different versions of this, but basically, eventually you're going to go into exile. Eventually, the nations will rule over you. And if you have books, they'll take your books. They'll have your books. And I want this Torah to be something that generates a relationship between me, the divine, and the people of Israel. And the only way we're going to hold on to that relationship in a really real way is if the chain of transmission is oral. You, Moshe, heard it from me, and you're going to tell other people, and we're going to all stay connected in that way. And God says, I don't want it all written down in a book. And well, I think that the question of like sort of power of human hands, I think that could apply just as much with a written work, right? If you wrote down oral Torah, you could have that power, but the difference is what can be handed over. And that also is a pro-con that cuts both ways. And this is why I think that these are really ethical decisions, even though we don't always frame them that way. I think it's beautiful to say that oral Torah allows us to be in relationship with the divine. And I think it's beautiful to say that that oral Torah allows us to be in relationship to those who've been in relationship to those who came before, and creates this chain of transmission. And I also know experientially that if you are not the person that the teachers of Torah believe should be in that space, then oral Torah is a tool that's not going to positively impact your life. Because if you can't get into those rooms, then all the oral teaching in the world is not going to help you. And for that, you need books. And that's a really different technology with a really different use case. And we'll talk more about that next time. And I really want to leave you thinking about these questions. It's nice. I like teaching like 3 weeks in a row. So you really have like a week to notice in your life as you're learning, as you're teaching, as you're reading, where are those use cases for oral Torah in your life? What's it really good for? What does it add to the user experience of Torah to have oral Torah? And what's the best use cases for written Torah? What's it really good for? The next stage of our learning together will then, or the final stage of our learning together, will then be to think about digital Torah, or what might come after digital Torah, but really what are the aspects of oral and or written Torah that you would want to preserve, that you would want to enhance for whatever technology comes next. So thank you guys so much for learning with me tonight. As you can probably tell, these are some of my favorite things to talk about and to learn about. My email address is on the sheet. I welcome your comments and questions throughout the week, and I hope to see you all back here next week. Thank you. Liliana, I don't know if you have any announcements.
I do have a few
Thank
quick
you.
announcements on Drisha's end. First of all, thank you so much, Rabbanit Wolkenfeld. That was so interesting. Wow. And thank you to all our participants for being part of our learning community. Before we go, a few announcements about Drisha's upcoming classes. Please join us for Nature and the Supernatural in Medieval Ashkenaz, the Renee and Alexander Baum Memorial Lecture with Dr. David Schoenowitz, which is meeting this Sunday, the 3rd of December at 7 p.m. on Zoom and on Facebook Live. And very excitingly, our Winter Zman registration is now open. We will be kicking off the next Zman with a special short program on organ donation from December the 25th to the 27th. And we'll be continuing lots of our amazing classes, including the Mishnah in Depth project, which will be continuing with Ketubot with Rabbanit Leah Sana. So you can find out about all those and many more at 5784.drisha.org/winter, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all back here next week. Thank you.
Guys, have a great week. Bye-bye.